Welcome. This is the fourth live stream for TR, Traditional Right. This is where we discuss the week's news and see where it takes us. If you have questions or comments, you can send them into the live chat on this video here, or send them via email at traditionalright@gmail.com. Alternatively, you can just send comments on Traditional Right articles, and if you have questions or something there, I'll browse through them and pull out some interesting comments or questions that we can read here as well. I've got the usual cast here. I've got Jeff Groom.
Hi.
Got John, our fellow editor and facilitator.
Hey, guys.
And Mr. William S. Lind.
Cheers.
So I've just got some light news to start us off with. We've got a government shutdown looming, and really my initial thoughts with the government shutdowns is that it amounts to political theater. I'm not really sure when a vote is supposed to happen on this one, but it functionally doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is that basically everything is still funded for this one. Even if a government shutdown, quote unquote, were to happen, the only things that would shut down would be some meaningless programs and bureaucracy. So I just kind of wanted to see, Bill, what are your thoughts on the government shutdowns? Why are they seen as so politically toxic, and why is there such a big deal made over them?
Well, you're correct, Brent. They're political theater. They're kabuki. The essential government services continue to function, and everybody knows that pretty quickly somebody's going to blink, and it's really all meaningless. But I'll tell you a story about the one time it could have been very meaningful indeed. It was the first government shutdown. This occurred in the time when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House and Clinton was president. And they pushed an impasse, I forget what it was over, to the point where we had the first government shutdown. And Clinton dismissed temporarily all, quote, non-essential government workers. Well, I knew Newt very well, and Paul Weyrich was in constant communication with him. I was then with Paul at the Free Congress Foundation. And I went to Paul and said, this is the opportunity we have been waiting for a generation to greatly shrink the size of the federal government. What Newt needs to do is say that he is going to move to permanently defund all government employees who have been designated by the Clinton administration as non-essential, on the grounds that the taxpayer should not be paying the salaries of non-essential employees. It was a golden opportunity. Newt didn't have the guts to seize it, and Newt blinked. And we got this continuing series still going on today where it's all just kabuki. But there was one tremendous opportunity there, which the Republicans, in their usual fashion, being geniuses at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, threw away.
So I think most people can see that for what it is. Most people say, yeah, sure, shut the government down. I don't care. It doesn't affect me at all, because it doesn't.
For the most part, it doesn't. The first thing they do always is close the Washington Monument. In fact, we
of course,
Washington Monument Syndrome in Washington. But that first opportunity, the Democrats realized quickly that they'd made a huge blunder, and they never again labeled the people who don't get paid as non-essential. But they did it that first time. And there was the opening. It occurred once. Again, the Republicans, as usual, it's the evil party versus the stupid party, and the stupid party missed the opportunity.
Yeah. Sort of on the new note, Obamacare was recently declared unconstitutional by some lower judge. I actually know who did it, but again, I don't think it functionally matters. My thoughts on this is that this ruling will, go through some, chains of command, and eventually it'll probably get sent back to the Supreme Court, and they'll just reaffirm what they already ruled on it, and we'll still have the Affordable Care Act.
I think that's likely. I don't see the Supreme Court overturning its precedents on this issue. And politically, it's actually more toxic for the Republicans because there are a lot of people now who are dependent on Obamacare for their health insurance, and obviously would be very unhappy if suddenly they found themselves uninsured. But I think either legally or politically, Obamacare is here to stay. You may be able to modify it at the margins, but you're not going to get rid of it. And it, of course, just continues the problem that we pay far more in this country for medical care than countries that have equally good care, Switzerland, Scandinavia, and so forth, are paying. And you'll never fix it because one of the biggest political contributors is all the various unions representing the doctors, the pharmaceutical industry, and all of the rest of it. As always on Capitol Hill, legislation is bought and sold, and the people with the money don't want us to find more efficient ways to provide health care.
Yeah, that's just it. There are much more efficient ways to deliver health care. Conservatives will always say, "Oh, well, I don't want socialized medicine," but that's exactly what we have. When you're paying into a pool for an insurance company, the way we use health insurance is we use it for everything healthcare related. So anytime you go to the doctor, you're using health insurance to pay for it. So it is functionally socialized then, because you never see the you never see the bill, and you're paying into a pool, and then that pool distributes money on your behalf. So we actually have socialized medicine. It's just somebody else is scraping a profit off of the top of it, which increases the overall cost.
Well, what you have here is the classic, the peak that you have to cross is where you go from trying to reduce prices to justifying costs. And as soon as you bring the government into the picture, it makes that transformation happen. I have a hospital bill for my grandfather in his last year, 1952. He was 80. And a hospital bill for 10 days in Oakland, Maryland. And everything except medicines, which he got at half price because he was a pharmacist, came to $10 a day. Now, if we multiply that by the rough inflation figure since that time, it might be $200 a day. Well, if it were $200 a day, most of us wouldn't need health insurance.
Right.
Because hospitals, since we'd be paying our own bills, most of us, would be under constant pressure to reduce prices. People would shop on price. But now that it's all, in effect, state capitalist insured, it's not quite socialism, but it's classic state capitalism. The game for the medical industry is justifying costs, and it's not $200 a day, it's thousands of dollars a day for a hospital room.
Yeah, it's not uncommon to see $10,000 a day for a hospital bill.
Exactly. And this is what happens when you switch from a free market that creates incentive for lowering prices to state capitalism or socialism, either one, where it all becomes a matter of justifying costs.
Yeah, there is a movement now with physicians that are in private practice that are going to an all cash based model where you buy services a la carte and all the costs are upfront and visible to the patients. And they're still making very good livings doing it, but the price of the services are drastically reduced when they don't have all the bureaucratic overhead to deal with.
My Amish friends, of course, don't have insurance, and they pay cash. And one of them needed a knee replacement, went in, and they agreed to do it for, I think it was $13,000.
That's incredible.
I know. That's what happens when it's real people paying real money for the medical service they need.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if through insurance, it would be what, 60,000?
At least, at least.
At least, yeah.
Right. So the old way worked, but we've created this gigantic middleman that's, again, state capitalist. These insurance companies' profits don't come from producing a better product at a lower price. They come through their deals with government. And once you've done that, then there's no incentive for anyone to cut prices.
I'll always come down on the side of a free market or free enterprise and private property. But if we have to have socialized medicine, I'd like to have just a nice, smooth, single-payer system where the U.S. government just doles out money and there's no more of this bureaucratic overhead. That is, I mean, we pay like, what is it, like 17% of our income goes to
gross national product, yeah.
Yeah, it goes to medicine, and everywhere else it's closer to like 5 or 10.
Right. It's we are getting tremendously shafted by this whole system. I did a column not too long ago saying I'm for Medicare for all, single payer.
Yeah.
Because it's the only way we can substantially cut our health costs. Because the individual in the current system has no bargaining power unless you're dealing with the kind of hospitals you'd have down in Amish country where they're accustomed to customers who come in and are going to be paying cash and make an agreement beforehand.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable that no one should go into bankruptcy for getting sick.
Right.
I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
It's at least not a good thing. That it's something that we definitely want to prevent, either through the government or like through our social networks, like privately. I'm sorry.
Right.
Go ahead.
If you go to Scandinavia, the medical care is excellent. It's free, and they don't spend anywhere near 17% of their GDP on medical care. It can be made to work. Now, maybe that takes Scandinavians to do it. I don't know.
Well, if we transferred some of the money we're spending on defense and put it towards healthcare, it seems like a reasonable solution.
Or infrastructure or anything else. We should be able to get a military that always loses its wars for less than $1 billion. I mean,
one would think. Yeah,
we could do what one Danish candidate from prime minister suggested and just replace the armed forces with an 800 number. And when you call it, it says we surrender in a variety of languages.
That works.
One thing that when people talk about healthcare in the United States that interests me is that after having traveled to a couple other countries, not a lot, but a few in Europe and Asia, is like I get a very strong vibe that Americans, compared to the rest of the world, we just don't take care of ourselves. We don't, generally speaking, stereotyping, eating right, exercising, not eating, until you're full every time, going out to eat and all that stuff. It's like, I feel like in America, all we do is treat the symptoms of our problems instead of the root causes. Like, is it cheaper to take care of yourself? Well, yeah, eating right. I'll put it this way. In the 1920s in America, in the 30s, it was rich people that were fat and the poor people were skinny. Today, it's the opposite, actually. It's the poorest people that are the most overweight because the food that they buy the cheapest is the most processed junk food, where to buy more expensive good food is only more for rich people. So now that's kind of been inverted. But I mean, with the single payer thing, it's like, I always thought a great idea would be like we do in the military. Like you have to hold standards for physical fitness based on your height, your sex, and your age. And if you're outside of those standards, then you're going to be pushed out of that system. So in America, maybe we should just say, okay, you get single payer, but you have to maintain these standards or you don't get your health care. You have to show that you're trying to like take care of yourself. And that's why it's called insurance when things happen that you maybe can't control. So,
Countercurrents.com ran an article a few years back describing a healthcare system like that. It must have come out around the time of Obamacare, like when that was first being talked about, or like after it was
okay, I'll check it out.
voted into effect. But basically, it was that like, yeah, we'll have a national healthcare system, but you only get it if you meet certain standards. Like if you take care of yourself, if you're like a productive member of society, like you don't get it just because you exist and you do whatever you want.
Right, and that's what you hear, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's all about rights. It's like everyone has a right to healthcare. It's like, well,
There's no such thing as rights.
yeah, there's I guess there could be, but it's responsibilities first, rights second. That's like Robert Heinlein said in Starship Troopers. Why did the democracies of the past fail? Well, because all their citizens only cared about their rights and not what they were responsible for. And that's like this whole healthcare debate is exactly what I see. It's like my right to healthcare. It's like, well, you don't take care of yourself, you don't eat right, you don't exercise, and you want someone else to pay for your lung insurance, surgery, and like, what moral right do you have to tell people how to
get out of here?
It pisses me off. It just makes me angry.
Yeah.
Well, do remember that very few conservatives are skinny, and that we all eat every day from the 4 basic food groups: sugar, fat, salt, and alcohol.
All right.
Let me touch on a few things from the recent newspapers.
Okay, go ahead.
Times, this is Wednesday, December 12th. Racist rants on campus arouse fury at Columbia. A Columbia student dressed in a button shirt and blazer. Terrible thing says, white people are the best thing that ever happened in the world. I love myself and I love my people. And perhaps most horrifying of all, he actually said, we built the modern claim he repeated several times during a 54-second video clip. Well, of course, as you can imagine, the university has basically crapped its pants, falling all over itself in apologizing and groveling and denouncing these as deeply disturbing. We are alarmed at the rise of instances of racism and hate speech in our world today. Columbia stands firmly against supremacist language and violence. But he said nothing bad about any other group. And imagine if this had been a black Columbia student, probably not dressed in button shirt and blazer, who was saying the same things about black people, although of course it wouldn't be true to say that black people invented the word as black people did. Instead, it's a statement of fact. This perfectly illustrates how cultural Marxism works. The dual standards could not be more naked. And what's important beyond is what the cultural Marxists on campuses at Columbus wanted in the country as a whole if they ever take power. If you were to say the same thing, not denigrating anyone else, not threatening anybody, just praising whites and their achievements, you would be on your way to the gulag, which is essentially what this student is now going to be within the university. That's the future they want for the whole country. And that's, we have to make sure they don't get anywhere near the levels.
We might be closer to that than we think.
Certainly, there are some Democratic candidates out there who undoubtedly would like to give us exactly the situation reported here at Columbia, where unless whites constantly grovel before blacks, third world immigrants, all the rest, you're in trouble with the law. This story, and this one too, is about cultural Marxism. And it is from today's, Sunday's, New York Times. Piece in the Weekly Review. Is there something as authoritarian voter? Well, this attempts to psychologize conservatives, of course, is common on the left. But what's interesting here is in today's New York Times, there's the Frankfurt School, origin of cultural Marxism. In the years after World War II, the philosopher and German, one of the 3 most important members of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, collaborated with social scientists at the University of California at Berkeley to investigate why ordinary people supported fascist, anti-Semitic ideology during the war. They used a questionnaire called the F scale. F is for fascism, and follow-up interviews to analyze the total personality of the potentially anti-democratic individual. The resulting 1,000-page tome, The Authoritarian Personality, published in 1950, of course, written by Adorno, found that subjects who scored high on the F scale disdained the weak and marginalized. The way that so-called F scale works in these interviews, if you said, I believe in strong families, that gave you a high score as a fascist. Anything you said that was favorable about traditional society, culture, religion, etc., gave you a higher score on the F scale. This has been completely debunked by sociologists. This is a laughingstock as a methodology. Yet the Times goes on to say some of their conclusions hold up well. Adorno and his colleagues describe Alex Jones as racist views expressed by many Trump supporters. The Times never points out that these guys were all Marxists. He never points out that Adorno's part of the Frankfurt School and that the Frankfurt School created what we know as political correctness. They're doing exactly what I've been saying for years that they do. They hide their real nature and objectives, and they're circling back to this same sociological garbage that, again, by all sociologists is recognized as garbage, that they were putting out in 1950, trying to say that all conservatives have this authoritarian personality, which means they really want fascism.
It's interesting that they're using, they've always called the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism, political correctness, whatever you want to call it, that umbrella, an entire conspiracy theory. And now they're using that as evidence towards their conclusion that basically, if you're white, you're automatically a fascist.
The same New York Times in October published a piece attacking me and my novel Victoria on the grounds that there is no such thing as cultural Marxism. And here they are, quoting the work and citing it as a good thing of most important cultural Marxists in terms of the invention of the whole ideology, which is Theodore Adorno.
Yeah. To be fair, they took all the data is compiled from Berkeley, California, so I'm sure that's not biased.
Not in any way, shape, or form. So we see this game continuing of hiding the real nature of what they are. And then the final piece, and this one I think is one we might want to take fairly seriously, even though it's in the style section of today's Times. Assume crash position. This is looking at the possibilities of certain economic factors setting off an enormous crash. In fact, they quote here, the billionaire investor Paul Tudor Jones recently posited that we are probably in a global debt bubble, which I have been saying for a long time. What happened here, and the article goes on to talk about this, and another piece in the Times notes that all the indices are down this year, which is very rare. Stocks are down, bonds are down, commodities are down. It's down all around the world. It's normally when one goes down, when stocks go down, bonds go up, and vice versa. Everything's going down because everybody sees this enormous debt bubble. And this covered over by the actions of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the Chinese National Bank, pumping out incredible amounts of liquidity, just printing money. They don't even have to print it anymore. They just type a few lines of computer code and bingo, they've got another 10 trillion. And all of this prosperity we've been looking at has been built on this gigantic bubble of liquidity. Well, those central banks are now reversing course. They're now raising interest rates. They are now getting rid of all the bonds they bought for the quantitative easing. And suddenly the air that supports the bubble is getting thin. And I think that this article is correct. Assuming the crash position is not a bad idea. And the other piece for the Times was titled, "Safest place to put your money may be your mattress." I think that has considerable merit.
At least while it's worth something.
Yes. Times earlier had one of the reporters in Beijing met with a bunch of Chinese economists, and they all told him everything you have to put in gold. So if we take what cultural Marxism has done to create enormous tensions throughout our society, and we couple that with a debt crisis, which isn't just a garden variety recession, it's a whole lot worse. It's a prolonged depression, like Greece is in today. What happens? You see in fourth generation war, Victoria, I'm afraid it's all too real possibility.
But the blame, who's the blame? We look at, now lost a little bit of steam here. But if we do have a recession or depression, global inflation, who are the people going to blame? I guess it really comes down to, are people going to admit who the problem is? And that's been the 1%, the top 1% who have basically, sold out their loyalty to their countries and replaced it with loyalty to money. And that's clear to most people, I think.
What's very interesting is
John. Just a minute. John and Bill, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Now we can't. You were silent for a long while.
We're experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. John, can you turn off the video and we'll see if that can save us some bandwidth and maybe we can clear up the audio.
Yeah. Can you not hear us at all?
It's very garbled.
How about now?
That's okay right now. We can continue the conversation and we'll see how that goes.
Okay, were you able to catch what I was saying?
Towards the beginning, it was understandable, but for the last couple minutes, it's been very difficult to understand you.
Okay.
Okay. So basically, we were just talking.
This sounds a lot better. This sounds a lot better.
Okay. Good. Really, we're just talking about how a potential financial disaster, in terms of financial collapse or runaway inflation, could influence, I guess, the future as far as whether or not people recognize who's to blame for the financial crisis that we're heading towards.
And what happens when you take the social and cultural and moral tensions that have been created by cultural Marxism's assault on our traditional culture and on white middle-class people, and then you add a depression into that. Can the social fabric still hold together at that point? And I'm afraid the answer may be no. Yes, the elites are to blame, and the interesting thing is the elites, both the political and the financial elites, are all either cultural Marxists or they're afraid to stand up to it, because you can't socially be a member of the elite and defy it. So are the people in the heartland going to see this interesting connection?
Right, yeah.
Normally we think of the wealthy as being conservative, but the wealthy in places like New York City, San Francisco, they are not conservative at all. They are, again, either believing cultural Marxists or they're too cowardly to stand up to it. So this could be a very interesting political mix.
Yeah, so Jeff, you had an article that you pulled up on Russia. Why don't you go ahead and give us your spin on that?
Yeah, so it's basically a Wall Street Times article that was out this week about some groups within Russia, as they're talking about, Vladimir Putin's been around for, so many years, and what does the future hold? But there's a group called the Double-Headed Eagle Group that's named after Russia's coat of arms. It's flourishing. A number of regional branches grew by almost half this year to more than 50. Started in 2016, the group says it wants to enlighten people about Russia's pre-Soviet past and resurrect Russian traditions. It is trying to bring back Tsarist-era names of towns and streets as well as the monarchy. And then another part in the article, it says that there was a big group of Christian Orthodox priests that were cheering for Vladimir Putin because he's brought back traditionalism to Russia. So I thought this was a really good article, and just the average American, that doesn't feel like they need to read history at all. Most people that are alive today only known Russia being communist. You know, the Russians are communists, all that. Yes, they were, but in over 1,000 years of history, that's just a small little snapshot of their culture and their way of life. And if you look at, you know, the Crimean War with Nicholas I, I mean, these were devoutly, you know, Christian people, and they saw themselves actually as fighting, you know, Islam in the Ottoman Empire, and Russia was deeply, you know, as a national character, they were wounded by what they saw as France and Britain stabbing them in the back to fight, you know, alongside the Ottoman Empire. But I just thought it was interesting to see that, you know, there's this push towards traditionalism in Russia, kind of the lives that they used to have after they experimented with communism. And to me, like, you know, Bill said multiple times, like, I don't see why Russia should not be, you know, our number one ally right now. I mean, we both have resources, we have land, we want borders, we want our culture to be intact. How's that not a match made in heaven? I don't know, but of course, we have to have enemies to justify what's going on with the defense budget.
Much of the assault on Trump over the non-existent collusion with Russia in the election has been designed specifically to make it politically impossible for him to work with Russia and to build the alliance with Russia that our international position dictates should be what we're doing. And that unfortunately has largely been successful, even though the entire investigation has so far found nothing. But the degree to which the military-industrial congressional complex in Washington must have Russia and China as threats in order to justify, again, the $1 trillion a year we throw away on so-called defense is driving this train. It's all, again, being driven by money, because Capitol Hill now is all about money. Come to Capitol Hill poor, very few of them go home poor. And so I think much, if not all, of this investigation of Trump over Russia has been designed specifically and precisely to prevent the Russian alliance we need. That would also raise a question of, okay, now why are we spending so much money on defense if Russia isn't a threat?
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah, when Trump was running for president, I mean, his instinct said, like I don't know, why should we be, you know, enemies with Russia? I think Russia could be an ally. You know, he saw we have similar, if they want to kill ISIS and we want to kill ISIS, shouldn't we be friends? Why are we enemies? And that's what his instincts told him, and they were right. But like you said, you know, the state and the swamp is, you know, reasserting itself and not letting that happen.
And I think a monarchical restoration in Russia is a real possibility. There are reports, I don't know how credible, that President Putin himself wants as his successor a restored monarchy. And you'll notice he has not groomed anyone to be his successor as a president, which would make sense if his real goal is to restore the House of Romanov. The Romanovs have been invited back to Russia. A lot of their property has been restored. There are numerous organizations like this Double Eagle Group. And this is, in my mind, a very hopeful development.
I didn't realize there were any Romanovs left.
Oh, there are Romanovs left. However, their marriages were all morganatic. So there would have to be a modification in the succession laws to allow them to come to the throne. That would not be, shall we say, an insuperable problem. So my answer is Tsarstvo obratno v Rossiyu, restore the Tsar.
And one last thing on that, this is not related to this article, but I saw it on Twitter maybe 6 months ago or so, but it was a billboard in a rural part of Russia, and it had a picture of Tsar Nicholas II, the last Romanov, you know, who was abdicated and then murdered by Marxists. And it said in Russian, "Forgive us, Your Majesty." So I mean, it's almost like they have. I mean, granted, this is one little snapshot, but it's almost like the Russians have kind of, you know, saw, hey, we tried this experiment and it ended up being a disaster for our people and our country, and you know, we probably went too far, and they're kind of, I don't know, like trying to atone, maybe, you know, forgive us, Your Majesty, for what we did to you. So I thought that was fascinating.
That is not an unusual sentiment in Russia today. I'm hoping for the same sentiment in Germany and Austria.
I think we'll get there.
So anything else?
Yeah, John, you had something that you wanted to talk about?
I just wanted to mention briefly, they had some developments with the Paris Climate Agreement this past week. They ratified, there was I believe a 200 nation coalition that ratified basically new rules for industrialized societies. And obviously they want to punish those who are already successful industrialized societies in order to allow, basically it's just a societal leveling, economic leveling to make, or to allow third world countries to go through an industrial revolution, but not affect climate change. Now, they're incorrect for assuming we have as much impact on climate that we actually do. Nature has much more effect on climate than humans ever have. But also interesting to point out was that it's also legally binding. So for any of these countries to get out, as we saw with Brexit, they want to make sure it's as difficult as possible for nations to get out of these deals. And the goal for this is to only march closer towards global hegemony. That's probably another reason why they hate the United States and Russia alliance prospectively so much, is neither country wants to subscribe to globalism. So the climate accords, which Trump was smart to at least not sign, we're not necessarily out of the Paris Climate Agreement until 2020 officially. But getting out of that and TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, were huge as far as actually stopping our march towards the global hegemony that we've been seeing.
The greater danger even than that is that environmentalism offers the most compelling basis that any ideology has ever found for creating a completely totalitarian society. Because the environmentalists can argue that everything you do, including every breath you take, affects the environment, and therefore they have a right to control it. In Victoria, I play this scenario out in Cascadia, which after the breakup of the US is the nation formed for Oregon, Washington State, and British Columbia. The deep green environmentalists take over Cascadia, and if you're not one of them, they deny you a breathing license and tie a plastic bag over your head, because you have no right to breathe. You're affecting the environment with every breath you take. So conservatives' concern about environmentalism and where it could lead us, yes, globalism certainly is part of that concern. The fact that if we put stringent limits on our energy usage is not going to change the fact that both India and China are building new coal-fired power plants as fast as they can. But even more fundamentally, there's no better basis to create a completely totalitarian world than environmentalism. And far too few people see that potential.
Yeah, the global ice caps were supposed to melt by this year, I believe, Al Gore claimed back in like 2000, 2001.
And the southern one is growing, by the way.
Right. Well, it's breaking up too.
Antarctica.
Yes.
Yeah, but there are parts of Antarctica where the ice is growing.
Yeah.
You're correct, John, that nature is far more powerful than man. But men can use this argument that we're affecting nature, again, to take power and to take absolute power.
Control. And
the more panic people get over global warming and climate change, which may in the end turn out to be global cooling anyway, linear projection is seldom accurate, the more willing they will be to hand over power to this kind of ultimate totalitarian regime, worldwide totalitarian regime.
I don't see any reason to disbelieve that humans are affecting the climate, whether we're warming it or cooling it or just, I mean, the climate is just such a complex mechanism that it's hard to say like what exactly we're doing. But when you're putting like so much CO2 into the atmosphere, basically in geologic time overnight, you can't say that that's not having an effect. And we can see that as industrialism occurred and is growing, so is the output of CO2 and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So
are you sure? Are you sure about that though?
We have a bigger problem with just how many people are here than the climate
change.
Right.
Yeah. that's where I was going. It's like there's bigger issues too. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, of course we don't want a totalitarian government based on environmental justice, and also there's there's frankly just way
Right.
too many people on the earth.
Yeah.
And we the developed nations tend to take all the blame for the environmental damage, but it's really just the developing ones in Asia and Africa that are causing nearly all the
Right.
damage. 93% of the oceanic plastic is carried out through 10 rivers in Asia and Africa. 93% of all the oceanic plastic.
Right.
So it's not us that's doing the damage if there is in fact damage being done.
Yeah, I think the constant. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the constant theme I think you see of true environmentalism, being good stewards of the environment, has only been achieved through countries that are Western, that have gone through the Industrial Revolution and have figured out how to conserve. Like Brent just said, China's the biggest polluter of the oceans. Guess who's way down at the bottom? The U.S. of A. So what's people's points when they say, oh, well, we're such a polluter? We're like, yeah, we went through that phase, but now we've figured out how to be more efficient and actually conserve. Like, we almost cut all the buffalo, but then we figured out how to conserve them, and now they're back, to good levels. So I agree with you, but I do disagree with you about the CO2 thing, because John Moore, who's one of the founders of Greenpeace, became a climate skeptic, and I didn't know this until I read his article, because it's all science. We need to quantify what we're talking about, right? It's science. Scientists say all these things. So today, there's only 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is actually at a global historic low. During the first ice age, it was like 1,400 parts per million of CO2. And at 400 parts per million, actually plants, because they use CO2 in photosynthesis, they're actually on a starvation diet. So what do you pump into a greenhouse to make plants grow? CO2. And so if we drop CO2 levels a lot more, John Moore is making this argument that we could actually start killing off crops if we drop CO2 too much lower. But that's what kind of they're saying. So we have to drop all these emissions because CO2 is high. Well, actually, no, CO2 is parts per million is at an all-time low. So what are you saying? So I disagree about that.
Well, the problem at root is that modern media have broadcast the American way of life to everyone on the planet. And everyone on the planet now wants to have an American standard of living, but they can't. The planet can't produce that. I mentioned before, one of the classic examples is China deciding to become an automobile society. That's insane, because their population is concentrated into a small portion of their land area, which is also their only arable land, which they're now having to pave in great quantities for all the damned cars. China should have had a tax of $10 million a year on private automobile ownership while they built, which they have done, a terrific high-speed passenger rail network. And now they're adding enormous urban rail networks, light rail, heavy rail, subway, etc. That should have been the future for China. But instead, they've gone the automobile route because they want to play this absurd game that every Chinese can have the same life as every American, where our population density is very low. And you can the idea of Indians, every Indian having an American way of life, every African having an American way of life, but they all want it because they see it on a video screen all the time.
Well, I think the idea of every American having an American way of life is kind of insane too. It doesn't matter how low our population density is. Think about just the economic, the environmental consequences of every person having multiple vehicles.
It's unsustainable.
Which is absurd, and it comes because our public transportation is so lousy, which is one of the reasons that, like my old colleague Paul Weyrich, I've always been a very strong supporter of better public transportation. The average ownership car of an automobile, all costs included, is about $8,000 a year. For people who are making $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year, if every member of the household has to have their own car, this is an enormous economic burden. Far better if you could just give the kids each a transit pass every year at Christmas. And in, for example, most of Europe, that's exactly what you can do. You don't need a car to get around. We've created a society which is automobile dependent, because the government and the road gang, which is the highway builders, the automobile manufacturers, the tire companies, the oil industry, all of the rest of it, work together to destroy the excellent rail-based public transportation we had. With 24,000 passenger trains a day in this country that went everywhere, and with streetcar systems in every American city that had more than 5,000 people. So you took the train to town and you got around locally on the streetcar. You didn't need a car. They deliberately destroyed that. It was all, by the way, privately funded. It was all private companies that operated those streetcars and those trains. And they had to compete against highways built by the government. Well, when you subsidize one competitor and tax another one, guess what happens? But it's an unsustainable situation. It's an economically absurd situation, and it's been deliberately created.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, most of the bubble that's been created is to support this mentality that we can provide this to everybody.
Exactly. Yeah. And the poorest state in the country, Mississippi, the people spend the largest portion of their income on transportation costs because there's basically no public transportation. The lowest percentage of the personal budget spent on transportation is New York City, because you have excellent public transportation, even though the subway at the moment is falling apart. Bad choices in past years, all of them again driven by the classic government corruption. The railroads had very little money to give to members of Congress, and the car companies, and the oil industry, and the tire makers and all the rest had a lot. So what kind of policy do we get? The best money can buy.
Yeah. My last bit on global warming is that I see the constant theme that they always have, and it's, I think Bill mentioned it, it's the persuasion of fear. Like the most useful, the best type of persuasion is always fear, because human beings react to that. And what are the arguments that these people are making? They're not talking about, well, the world has warmed by X amount of degrees, and if you give us this amount of money, we can drop. They're not really saying, they're not making scientific arguments. They're just saying, they're appealing to authority, which is another type of persuasion, saying 99% of scientists agree that it's real, and you could possibly die, or you might not have food. So they're using persuasion techniques, which is smart on their part, but it's not even grounded in science. They're making people afraid, and when people are afraid,
from government's perspective, always remember, fear is a growth industry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the same way with, military industrial media, congressional complex. Like, we have to be ready to fight our enemies, and the enemies are at the door. And if we don't do anything, you're going to be in trouble. So it's the same type of persuasion.
Yeah. And whereas, with claims of like racism and everything, they claim victimization as being the reason why certain things are defined as racist or not racist. It's the same thing with the planet. We basically define the planet as the greatest victim of all, and we need to do everything we can to stop this perceived problem from happening. Like, even if you, like you mentioned, Jeff, there's not a lot of basis in science for these theories that they peddle.
Right. I recently read Nate Silver's book. It's called The Signal and the Noise, the 538 forecasting guy. And he's a couple of really good chapters there about the difference between prediction and forecasting. He talks a little about climate change. And he actually said in there that, so weather forecasts, you see it on the news and it goes out 7 or 8 days or whatever. And they studied these historically, and they found that at 9 days, a weather forecast is so inaccurate that a more accurate prediction of weather is to look at what the weather was on that day a year previous to that. So the way I see it is, if you can't tell me what the weather is going to be 9 days from now, how can you tell me with any degree of certainty what the weather will be 20 years from now, and that it's going to be drastically different than it is today? I mean, that is a humongous hypothesis that is not grounded in any modern science, and it's never been repeated. So they're definitely grasping at straws by trying to predict what the future is going to hold for climate.
It's certainly not evidence that you would base an international treaty on.
For sure, absolutely.
Remember, as always, it's not about the climate, it's about money, and it's about power, like everything else.
Yeah, that's basically my stance on environmentalism. Is okay, we can address certain environmental issues. We want to have clean air, we want to have clean water, and that's common sense stuff. Of course we want that, but you don't do it by having a carbon tax or any other of these just absurd legislation that governments want to produce in the name of environmentalism. Really, just what political environmentalism does is just allow the expansion of government and expansion of taxes and other, power grabbing legislation.
That's certainly what we're seeing in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing disregard for the law of diminishing returns. In other words, if here in Cleveland, we look back on the state of the Cuyahoga River 30 years ago, obviously today it's vastly cleaner. Is that a good thing? Of course it is. But it's clean enough now that fish are swimming in it and breeding in it, and it's kind of becoming a normal river. The environmentalists would say we have to keep spending and spending and spending and spending to get the last tiniest little bit of anything out of the river that wasn't there when the first white man came.
Right.
Well, this, again, in everything there is a law of diminishing returns, and in everything you have to say best is enemy of good enough. We've gotten a lot of things to where they're good enough, and to where getting more out of the water and more out of the air becomes exponentially more expensive for smaller and smaller returns. The ideologues pay no attention to that, because to do so means you're impure, regardless of what your cause is. You have to push it to the point of complete purity, or you're a hypocrite. And we see this in all of these ideological movements, and environmentalism is an ideological movement.
Absolutely. So we got an email from someone who goes by the name of Admiral Akbar. So Admiral, thank you for writing us.
Galleys, is your galleys or dhows?
I hope it's not a trap.
He has two comments. First of all, he's appalled that you referenced the New York Slimes, since it has zero credibility.
That's true.
The New York Times has great credibility when it's illustrating inadvertently cultural Marxism, when it's reporting the atmosphere of complete intolerance at Columbia University, and probably even on some financial issues, because there are actually numbers there. Every page of the Times drips with venom about Trump. I'm very well aware of that. But there are some useful things nonetheless buried there, and I think we found a few tonight. I can't imagine a better place to quote from, showing that the Frankfurt School is alive, well, and disguising itself just as much as it always has.
His second comment is in regards to your most recent article, The View from Olympus, Our Failing Strategy. And he says that basically our failing strategy can be attributed to the neocons, Israel, and certain dual citizens within the U.S. government.
Well, the neocons certainly bear a great deal of responsibility for it, because the neocons' drive is to rule the world. America is to establish the universal monarchy, as it used to be called, complete world hegemony where we can dictate to everyone else in the world. And of course, Martin Van Crefeld years ago called me and said, I want to write a book called The American Riddle. And I said, well, Martin, there's no riddle. It's American exceptionalism, which follows Spanish exceptionalism and French exceptionalism and English exceptionalism. And all of these countries at their peaks thought they were exempt from the laws of history. They could establish the universal monarchy. They could rule the world. And they all overextended and fell. And we've done exactly the same thing. And the neocons are certainly part of the reason we've done that. The neo-libs, by the way, are very similar in their foreign policy views. Hillary Clinton was a neoliberal, but she and John Bolton have a great deal in common. Not just the mustache.
So, Bill, it is kind of obvious that we've got some serious foreign influence in our government. Like, how do we address that?
That is a particularly difficult subject to address because that foreign influence is not just in the executive branch. That foreign influence is extremely powerful on Capitol Hill. And it's not, we tend to think of it as one country in particular, and there's certainly one that is probably more powerful than all the others. But it is not alone in having influence. I mean, we're watching Saudi influence in our government right now.
Right.
I happen to agree with President Trump that it is absurd for us to sacrifice our strategic interests because the Saudis killed one of their own citizens on
foreign soil.
Right, yeah.
Not our problem.
Not our problem. However, we are also letting those Saudi ties drag us deeper and deeper into the civil war within Islam between Shiites and Sunnis, which we have no dog in that fight. We should not be involved in that fight. We should just encourage both sides to fight fiercely, kill as many of the other side as possible, and sell weapons to both, preferably on cash arrowhead.
Lots of money to be made there.
Lots of money to be made there, and as long as we view it from afar, fight fiercely, fellows. That's all I can say on both sides. If they're fighting each other, that's that much less energy they have to fight us.
Well, that's the only email we have. If anybody else has a question or comment for the panel, feel free to comment just about anywhere, any of Bill's articles or any articles on traditional right. Send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com, or you can comment on the video here on YouTube, either in the live chat or later. I'll still go through and read the comments and pull out some questions if there are any. Bill, you want to plug your books?
Always want to plug the books. We've been talking about Victoria under the pen name Thomas Hobbes because it is an update of his 17th century book, Leviathan. And we are moving slowly but steadily, and perhaps at an increasing speed, toward the Victoria scenario. It's set 50 years in the future after this country has broken up in fourth generation war. And of course, my co-authored book with Lieutenant Colonel Greg Thiel, the Fourth Generation Warfare Handbook, for those who would like to get a better understanding of fourth generation war. Got a call, interestingly, recently from a Marine at the Naval Postgraduate School. He told me, we are not even allowed to use the term. The military is so desperate to pretend that war is going to remain a jousting contest between state militaries that they aren't even allowed to use the term for the kind of wars we've been losing. And coming out next quarter will be my book, Retroculture, which is the antidote to cultural Marxism and to our breakup, which is a recovery of the old ways of doing things. Because the old ways, those that we followed before that slum of a decade, the 1960s, worked.
We'll be doing a lot more on retroculture going forward because that offers the solutions. We can complain all day about what's wrong with the world, but when you offer a solution, that's how we begin to turn things around.
Exactly. And Victoria is called Victoria because that's the name of the country in the former northeast of the United States that is successful in putting retroculture into action. And it has named itself Victoria because the people who created that very successful American culture we knew up to the 1950s, above all, were the Victorians, who were remarkably successful people from whom we can learn a great deal.
And Jeff, you've got a book too, so go ahead and tell people what it is.
Sure. Just backtrack real quickly about Admiral Akbar's email. I used to think the same thing about the New York Times, and then my uncle, who's a pretty conservative guy, investment banker, he's a very well-read guy. I asked him, I saw him with a paper one day, and I said, "Why are you buying the New York Times?" He said, "You got to know what the enemy's thinking." So it's an MLCOA, enemy's most likely course of action. So you should read them just to understand your enemy. That's step one. Know your enemy, know yourself. So that's that. But for my book, yeah, American Cobra Pilot, A Marine Remembers, The Dog and Pony Show. It's on Amazon, Kindle, hardback, and softcover. And one chapter I could plug, since we were talking about the government shutdown, on October of 2013, October 1st, when the fiscal years begin. We had a government shutdown, actually shut down, and our whole squadron ground to a halt. And the way we justified bringing all the useless civilians back into work that make us happy and keep the wives, entertained was because it contributed to readiness. So they canceled our flight schedule in order to send all the MIFLICs and the family readiness officers back to work in the name of happiness. So they held the military, the government put a gun to the military's head and asked the American people if they wanted to pull the trigger. And of course, the American people said no because they didn't want to not support the military. So there's an entire chapter about what the priorities are in the military and who are non-essential personnel.
And with all of our aircraft grounded, Jeff, who invaded us?
Say that again. Who? With all of our?
With all of our
I don't know.
aircraft. And obviously, we were defenseless. Someone must have invaded and conquered us, and I didn't even notice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, exactly. It was a flawless victory.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in for TR Live, and we'll be back again next week. Catch you later.